Richard Ramirez, known as the Night Stalker, was a serial killer who spread terror in California during 1984 and 1985. What made him so feared was not just his violence, but the randomness of his attacks. His victims did not have a clear profile, and his murder methods varied, which confused the authorities. He was born February 28, 1960, in El Paso, Texas. His childhood was marked by domestic violence and a strong negative influence from his cousin Miguel, a Vietnam veteran who showed him graphic images of murders he committed during the war. Miguel even murdered his wife in front of Richard, an event that deeply traumatized him, and that many believe contributed to his development as a criminal. Ramirez was deeply influenced by the occult and Satanism, and he used satanic symbols at his crime scenes. This, along with his disheveled appearance and piercing eyes, made him an almost mythical figure of fear. It attacked at night, entering the homes of its victims while they slept, raped, murdered, and robbed, leaving a trail of terror and chaos. In total, 14 confirmed murders are attributed to him, and over 30 assaults and rapes. Its capture was almost cinematic. In August 1985, a series of clues and testimonies led the authorities to publicly identify him. A group of citizens in Los Angeles recognized him on the street, chased him down, and detained him until the police arrived. During his trial, he displayed defiant behavior. Drawing pentagrams in the room and declaring his loyalty to Satanism, he was sentenced to death in 1989, but spent the rest of his life in prison before dying of cancer in 2013. Richard Ramirez's childhood was dark and marked by violence, abuse, and a series of traumatic experiences that shaped his personality. He was born February 28, 1960, in El Paso, Texas. Being the youngest of 5 children in a family of Mexican descent, his father, a former police officer who worked as a laborer, was known to have an explosive temper and physically abuse his children, which caused Richard to spend a lot of time away from home to avoid conflicts. From an early age, Richard suffered head injuries. At the age of 2, he was hit by a metal lamp, and at the age of 5, he was rendered unconscious after a swing hit him in the forehead. These injuries caused him seizures and possible neurological damage, which some experts say could have influenced his violent behavior later. The most disturbing influence on his childhood came from his cousin Miguel, a Vietnam War veteran. Miguel told him graphic stories of torture and murder he had committed in Vietnam. Showing disturbing photographs as evidence for Richard, these images seemed fascinating. Instead of repulsive when he was 13, he witnessed Miguel murder his wife, shooting her in the head during an argument. This traumatic event deeply impacted Richard, but instead of walking away, he continued to idolize his cousin. As he grew up, Ramirez began to experiment with drugs such as marijuana and LSD, and became interested in Satanism. This interest intensified through readings on the occult and his rebellion against the Catholic religion, with which he had grown up. Although he tried to work some casual jobs, his penchant for theft and criminal life took him down an increasingly dark path. What do you think of his childhood? It really comes across as a cocktail of fatal events that set his life on course for what would later be one of the most disturbing crime stories. Richard Ramirez's transformation into a serial killer was the result of a combination of trauma, negative influences, and a series of psychological and environmental factors that accumulated throughout his life. When he arrived in Los Angeles, he became involved in a life of petty crime, mostly robberies, but over time his crimes became more violent. He seemed to enjoy the power and control he gained by subduing his victims. And his lack of empathy led him to commit increasingly heinous acts. His modus operandi ranged from murders with firearms to mutilations and rapes, suggesting that he sought to experiment with different ways of wielding power and sowing terror, which led him to specifically become a serial killer. It was probably a mix of feeling invincible, his obsession with Satanism, and a total disconnect from morality. Richard Ramirez committed a series of extremely disturbing crimes, but three of the most notable for their brutality and impact on the community were the following. 1. The attack on the Day family in August 1985. This is one of the best known, as Ramirez broke into the Day family home in Glendora, California. He attacked couple Jenny William Day and their 8-year-old daughter. The crime being especially horrendous, Ramirez raped Jenny and murdered her, while her husband William was brutally beaten and also murdered. The case was chilling, not only because of the physical violence, but because of the lack of obvious motives and the chaos it left behind. 2. The murder of the Ortega family, May 1985. In an even more violent attack, Ramirez entered the Ortega family home in Los Angeles. She raped and murdered one of the women in the family, while her husband was shot in the head. During this crime, he left a trail of mutilations and robberies, which reflected the mixture of sadism and chaos that defined him as a murderer. The macabre thing about it was that the family was attacked without warning in the middle of the night. 3. The attack on Billy Maxon's family. March 1985, Ramirez entered his home, where he also raped the victims and attacked them mercilessly. During the assault, he left behind satanic symbols that intensified the atmosphere of terror and chaos that Ramirez fueled. This series of crimes left indelible marks on the community and generated widespread panic, since there seemed to be no pattern in his victims, which made them unpredictable and even more terrifying. Every one of these crimes left a deep mark, not only on the victims, but on all of California. Ramirez managed to plunge his victims into absolute terror before committing his murders, which made him one of the most notorious murderers in the history of the United States. The crime that is considered one of Richard Ramirez's worst was probably the murder and attack on the Gonzalez family, which occurred in the first months of 1985. A crime that combined the most terrifying of his modus operandi, brutality, chaos, and a personal stamp that made it even more disturbing. In the early hours of March 20th, 1985, Ramirez broke into the Gonzalez family home in Los Angeles. The house was a modest home and the family was completely unprepared. Ramirez, armed with a pistol, first attacked the parents, shooting both in the head. Not satisfied with the couple's murder, Ramirez raped the family's 14-year-old daughter that same night, and then proceeded to rob and destroy the crime scene. The case was notable not only for the violence, but also for the total lack of remorse that Ramirez showed during his attack. He left clear signs of his obsession with Satanism, writing symbols on the walls, including a pentagram, which was a characteristic stamp on many of his crimes. Relatives of surviving victims were subjected to psychological terror for days after the crime, given that there were no clear clues about the attacker's profile, which multiplied fear in the community. This crime was one of the points of no return in his series of murders, as it marked a level of cruelty that further expanded the panic. The police eventually managed to connect this crime to several others through similar patterns. But what made it the worst in its history was the intensity of the attack and the duration of suffering inflicted on the victims. It's a crime that not only reflects Ramirez's brutality, but also his extreme psychopathy, his inability to emotionally connect with his victims, and the need to completely dominate their lives before ending them. The police investigation into Richard Ramirez began to take shape after his crimes became more notorious, and the patterns began to become more evident. During the first attacks, Ramirez appeared to be a specter, leaving no clear footprints or following a logical pattern, which made identification difficult. However, as time passed and more victims fell, the authorities began to discover certain elements that would lead them to investigate the increase in crimes and the pattern more deeply. Throughout 1984 and 1985, Ramirez attacked more than 20 victims, which began to alert security forces, although his attacks did not have a clear pattern of race, age, or gender. There were eerie similarities. He entered houses at night. He used firearms, and his crimes included rape, murder, and mutilation. Besides, he used to leave satanic symbols like pentagrams at crime scenes. These details suggested that he was trying to send a message, and authorities began to see the possibility of a single perpetrator, physical evidence and testimonies. The police began to collect evidence, but the real breakthrough came thanks to the testimonies of witnesses. During several of the attacks, the surviving victims provided descriptions of the attacker, although the versions were somewhat vague due to the panic experienced. However, there was a key witness who helped enormously in one of the crimes. In particular, a neighbor was able to see Ramirez's face and describe it in enough detail to create a spoken portrait. Technological advancement and dissemination in the media, the police managed to make a spoken portrait of Ramirez, which was published in local newspapers. Unlike many serial killers who stay in the shadows, Ramirez was a character who in his own way enjoyed notoriety. After seeing his face in the papers, a group of citizens in Los Angeles recognized him. As he was walking through the streets of the city, they approached him and detained him. Until the officers arrived, the capture on August 31st, 1985, he was finally captured. He was recognized by a group of citizens who, upon seeing his face in a newspaper, immediately identified him and chased him. After an altercation in the street, he was arrested, and when the police arrived, he was already in custody. The capture was key, as the killer was apprehended before he could continue his crime spree, the police at first. It wasn't clear to me that all the crimes were connected, but once Ramirez was arrested, the evidence was overwhelming. He was linked to a series of homicides through fingerprints, evidence of his M.O., and finally, confessions during the trial. The figure of the Night Stalker terrorized California for a time, but a combination of police work, technological advances, and community help was key to his capture. Richard Ramirez, known as the Night Stalker, was a serial killer who terrorized California in the 1980s. He committed a series of violent random crimes, leaving a trail of victims with signs of Satanism. He was captured thanks to citizen collaboration and a spoken portrait published by the police. His story remains one of the most disturbing in criminology. Thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to like it and subscribe if you are interested in learning more stories. Until next time.